The tea hasn't been dumped, the shots haven't been fired, the declaration hasn't been signed, but something is stirring. In a quiet Boston parlor, a woman reads a letter in the glow of candlelight. Her brother writes of taxes, tyranny, and the loss of liberty. Her hands tighten. Her world is about to change. Before the first shot of revolution echoed across Lexington Green, before the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, before the word America meant anything more than a faraway place on a king's map, there was a world building, breath by breath, moment by moment. Let's take a step back, further back than most history books begin. Back to the early 1740s, 50 years before revolution was even whispered. Imagine walking along the waterfront of Boston in 1740. The wind off the Atlantic carries the bite of salt and seaweed. Wooden ships creak as they sway in the harbor, masts swaying like the arms of giants. Nearby, dockworkers grunt as they unload barrels of molasses and sugar from the West Indies, their clothes stained with sweat and rum. You pass a group of children chasing a wooden hoop with a stick. A woman in a bonnet calls out from her shop window, offering bread still warm from the oven. There are no streetlights, no taxis, no billboards. Just lanterns and horse dung. The colony smells of earth and sea and wood smoke. This is British America, or at least that's what people are told. 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic coast, nearly 5 million people, some free, some enslaved. Englishmen by law, subjects of the crown, but already, something different is stirring in their bones. They don't know it yet, but they are becoming something new, something the old world isn't prepared for. You see, most colonists in 1740 have never seen England. They've never walked past Big Ben or bowed before a duke. They've never even glimpsed King George, but they know the land they walk on. The harsh winters, the hungry wolves, the aching backs from carving farms out of wilderness. Here, titles mean less than toil. A man's name may not matter, but his work ethic does. That's not the English way. That's something else, something American. Across the colonies, from the forests of New Hampshire to the rice fields of South Carolina, people are living lives shaped not by royal proclamations, but by local decisions. Town meetings become the heartbeat of colonial towns. Churches double as debating halls. Taverns become the soul of political chatter. It's messy, loud, democratic in a way England doesn't understand. Imagine this: a cobbler in Philadelphia, calloused fingers stained with dye, arguing over property taxes with a wealthy merchant at the tavern next door. Different class, different wealth. But in that room, over tankards of ale, they're equals in voice. This is not the British order. This is something wild, and it's not just white men. Women, though denied the vote, play powerful roles in community life, running farms, managing businesses, raising the next generation of colonists. Enslaved people, too, though shackled and silenced, carry with them traditions, resistance, and stories that will one day echo through freedom's struggle. Life in the colonies is hard. People freeze in their cabins. Children die young. Medical care is more superstition than science. Wars with native tribes are a constant threat. But still, there is opportunity. The land is vast, and in many ways, unclaimed. To some, it feels like destiny. They begin to believe something dangerous. We can govern ourselves, but don't be mistaken. These colonies are not a unified body. They're fragmented. Each one has its own government, customs, even dialects. A Virginian farmer in 1740 might see a Massachusetts sailor as foreign. There's no single American identity, only scattered sparks of it waiting to ignite. Yet despite the differences, they share something deeper: distance from the crown. 3,000 miles of ocean separate them from the king's court. Messages take weeks, sometimes months. In that vacuum, self-reliance grows. Local assemblies, colonial newspapers, shared grievances, these become the bones of a new body. A republic to be, and in the background of all this, the land breathes potential. A young George Washington is surveying the Virginia frontier. A teenage Benjamin Franklin is working as a printer's apprentice in Philadelphia. A girl named Mercy Otis is learning to read by candlelight because her brother sneaks her books, despite what society says about girls and education. They don't know it yet, but they'll shape a revolution. This is the world before the storm, before liberty became a battle cry, before redcoats and revolution, before treason and triumph. It's not yet America, but it's no longer England either. It's something. Becoming, it's easy to think the American Revolution just happened, like a lightning strike from a clear sky. One day, peace, the next, rebellion, but truth lives in the quieter spaces, in choices made at family tables, in sermons whispered in wooden churches, in the stubborn pride of people who didn't yet call themselves Americans, but were already beginning to think like them. Imagine a farmer on the edge of the Pennsylvania frontier in 1745. He's never been to London. He's never laid eyes on a redcoat. He's never tasted the tea poured in Parliament halls. But this land, these calloused hands, this life carved from forest and frost, that's his kingdom. His family reads the Bible by firelight, not the king's decrees. His neighbors elect the local sheriff. When a new tax is announced, it doesn't feel like royal policy. It feels like an intrusion. He may still toast to King George on New Year's. He may still hum old English ballads at harvest time. But deep down, he's becoming someone else, and he's not alone. All across the colonies, from the Carolinas to New England, people are beginning to live in a world that functions, more and more, without royal guidance. Out of necessity, not rebellion. There's just no time to wait for instructions from London when wolves threaten the livestock or crops fail in the fields. Local problems need local solutions. So, they start governing themselves. They elect assemblies, form militias, enforce laws, disagree, debate, and compromise, sometimes fiercely, that messy, unruly, passionate conversation. That's democracy in its infancy. And from this chaos, a strange new identity begins to take root. Pamphlets and newspapers start to spread ideas like wildfire, and not just British ideas. Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau make their way into colonial minds. They write about liberty, natural rights, government by consent. Colonial thinkers don't just read them, they live them. Picture a young woman in Connecticut. She's been taught that her place is the home, but her father leaves Locke's treatise on the kitchen table. She reads it, slowly, carefully. Her world begins to expand. She starts to ask questions. If kings rule by divine right, why are so many people suffering if freedom is natural? Why are some people enslaved? If government exists for the people, why is no one listening to them? These aren't just abstract questions. They become real, urgent, unsettling. The colonies are still loyal on the surface, but beneath, something is shifting. A new generation is rising, one that sees themselves not as subjects of an empire, but as citizens of a place that doesn't fully exist yet. They're farmers, merchants, preachers, sailors, widows, enslaved people. Apprentices, runaways, immigrants, rebels, dreamers, they don't all agree. They don't all imagine the same future, but slowly they begin to feel something powerful. This place is ours, and if it's ours, maybe we should decide how it's run. The seeds are planted. The soil is rich with anger, hope, and hardship. And just beyond the horizon, a storm is beginning to gather. They can't see it yet, but they can feel it. Every fire starts with a spark, and in 1754, that spark lit deep in the forests of the Ohio River Valley. It started small, barely a flicker, but it would grow into a blaze that would consume empires, redraw maps, and quietly set the stage for a revolution no one saw coming. Imagine this: you're a 22-year-old colonial officer, all proud, unsure. Your name, George Washington, not yet the father of a country. Just a young man from Virginia sent to deliver a message to the French. Leave these lands, or there will be consequences. The French don't leave. Within months, bullets are flying through the trees. Washington leads a skirmish that kills a French officer, and suddenly, the British Empire is at war with France. But this isn't a war fought in the cobbled streets of Europe. It's a frontier war fought in the mud, in the cold, in the vast, tangled wilderness of North America. The French and Indian War isn't just about borders. It's about control, trade, power, pride, and the British aren't fighting alone. They call on the colonies. They expect loyalty, they expect soldiers, they expect money. Tens of thousands of colonists answer the call. From Massachusetts to Maryland, young men join militias, believing they're defending their homes, defending the British crown. But what they find is far from glory. Imagine being 17, far from your family, sleeping on frozen ground. Your commander is a British officer who treats you like a nuisance. You fight, you bleed, but you're paid less, fed less, respected less. And you begin to wonder, are we allies or subjects? Back home, the tension grows. The British Parliament expects the colonies to help fund the war. After all, they're defending their land, aren't they? But colonists aren't so sure. Taxes increase. Supplies are seized. British generals override colonial leaders. And resentment builds, not in fire and rebellion yet, but in quiet conversations over dinner tables, in taverns, in churchyards after Sunday sermons. The colonists had always seen themselves as British, but suddenly that identity starts to fray. Why are they dying in forests thousands of miles from London, yet still treated as second class? Why are they sacrificing sons and silver? But given no voice in what comes next, by 1763, the war is over. Britain wins. France cedes nearly all its North American territories. Victory, right? But war is expensive, and now Britain is broke, and looking to the colonies to foot the bill. The British pass law after law, each one meant to tighten control, raise revenue, and remind the colonies who's in charge. But for the colonists, something has changed. They've fought. They've sacrificed. They've seen the empire up close, and it wasn't always noble. They've bled for land they're now forbidden to settle. They've funded a war that leaves them in deeper debt. They've tasted power, and they're not eager to give it back. And most of all, they've begun to see themselves not as a fringe of the British Empire, but as something separate, something capable, something free. The French and Indian War was fought for empire. But its legacy, a deep fracture between Britain and her colonies, one that no treaty could mend, one that would only grow wider, until it finally broke. The war is over. The British flag flies proudly from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. The colonists should be celebrating, but instead, they're seething. After nearly a decade of bloodshed, sacrifice, and unthinkable hardship, the colonists expected reward, land, opportunity, a chance to move west and start fresh on the fertile frontier. But in 1763, the British Crown handed down something very different, the Proclamation Line. It was a royal decree. Simple on the surface, colonists were forbidden from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. That land, the king declared, would be reserved for Native American tribes. The goal, peace, to prevent further conflict after the war's costly frontier battles with indigenous nations like the Ottawa, the Shawnee, and the Cherokee. But to the colonists, it felt like betrayal. Imagine a war veteran in Virginia. He fought for Britain, buried friends in frozen woods, and returned home with a promise of land on the frontier. Now, the land he fought for is off limits. He can see it, smell it. He's cleared the trees, built the beginnings of a cabin, and now the Crown says, go back. This isn't just a boundary, it's a slap in the face, a reminder, you're not in charge here. No matter how long you've lived here, no matter how much you've sacrificed, the line isn't just on a map, it's in the mind, a growing mental wall between the colonies and the empire that rules them. Newspapers erupt with criticism. Tavern conversations turn sharp. In town halls and homes, a dangerous question begins to surface. Who really owns this land? The British say the Crown does, but colonists, they begin to think differently. They argue, we've tamed this land, bled into its soil, raised our children here. Doesn't that mean something? And for many, the Proclamation Line isn't just about geography. It's about control. Who decides where they live? Who decides what they pay, what they plant, what they're allowed to dream? Of course, the British had reason to draw the line. The frontier was volatile. Pontiac's rebellion had proven that native tribes were not simply going to surrender their lands. But the Crown didn't consult the colonists, didn't negotiate, didn't ask, they ruled, and this is where the wound deepens. It's not just what the British do, it's how they do it. They treat the colonies like dependents. Like misbehaving children, not like partners. The war may have ended, but a more dangerous conflict has begun between expectation and reality, between pride and obedience, between identity and authority. In hindsight, the Proclamation Line was a warning bell, not a scream, not yet, but a low, steady hum of discontent. A line had been drawn, not just on a map, but in the hearts of the colonists, and once a line like that is drawn, it's only a matter of time before someone steps across it. The proclamation was meant to preserve order. Instead, it sowed resentment, and that resentment would only grow. Revolutions don't begin with gunshots. They begin with paper, with ink, with a seal pressed into wax, and in 1764, the British Parliament stamped its authority straight onto colonial lives, with something sweet and something far more bitter. The Sugar Act, at first glance just another trade law, but for colonial merchants, ship captains, and dock workers, it was a spark thrown on dry grass. The act lowered the tax on molasses, but for the first time, Britain actually enforced it. Customs officials cracked down. Smuggling, once a tolerated art form, was now a crime with real consequences. Imagine you're a rum distiller in Boston. Your father smuggled molasses from the Caribbean for years. The locals looked the other way. Even the British winked. It was part of the dance, but now, customs officers storm your warehouse, your barrels are confiscated, fines pile up, your business, your family's survival is at risk. And all the while, you wonder, who are they to decide? I've never voted for anyone in Parliament. This wasn't just about sugar. It was about consent. Who had the right to govern these colonies? And just as colonists were still chewing on that question, came the Stamp Act. For the first time, the British government wasn't just taxing imports. It was reaching directly into people's pockets inside the colonies. Under the Stamp Act, every newspaper, marriage license, legal contract, playing card, even dice, had to carry a royal stamp. And that stamp cost money. It hit everyone: merchants, ministers, sailors, lawyers, farmers, even students. A tax on words, on life itself, and worst of all, the colonists had no say, no representation. No debate, no vote. It came from Parliament, thousands of miles away, men most colonists had never seen, deciding how they should live. Outrage exploded like flint on stone. Crowds poured into the streets. Protesters burned effigies of stamp collectors. In Boston, a mock funeral for liberty turned into a riot. In some towns, tax collectors were tarred and feathered. In others, they resigned in fear. By the end of the year, the Stamp Act was impossible to enforce. And something incredible happened. Colonies that had always seen each other as strangers, New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, began speaking in one voice. For the first time, they organized. They sent delegates to the Stamp Act Congress. They wrote petitions, letters, speeches, declarations. They didn't call it revolution, not yet. They called it rights. In London, Parliament saw a rebellion. In the colonies, it felt like awakening. Imagine a young woman in Rhode Island reading her brother's letter from Boston. He writes of crowds singing in the streets, of newspapers filled with fiery words, of people beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they deserve a voice. Asterisk, asterisk, calm but firm. Asterisk, asterisk, this wasn't just about taxes. It was about dignity, the right to be heard, the right to matter, the right to say, "This is our home. We will not be ruled like children." The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, but the damage was done. The colonists had tasted unity, had felt their own power, and once that flame was lit, it would never go out. What begins in silence rarely stays silent. A protest in the street, a whispered meeting in a candle-lit tavern, a pamphlet passed hand to hand, folded into coat pockets, burned after reading. These were not the actions of rebels, not yet. They were the stirrings of a people beginning to believe that obedience could be questioned, and that courage might be found in unity. So who were they? The ones who dared to push back? Let's step inside a tavern on a chilly Boston evening in 1765. He's not wearing a uniform, not giving a speech from a balcony. He's a printer, a merchant, a blacksmith, a lawyer. But in this room, in this moment, he is more. He is a son of liberty. They weren't born into the title, they claimed it, like a spark claims dry timber. They were merchants angry at British taxes, artisans furious over lost wages, journalists armed with printing presses instead of muskets. In New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, men began to organize, secretly, boldly, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. To the crown, they were troublemakers. To their neighbors, they were protectors. They coordinated boycotts of British goods. They harassed tax collectors. They forced resignations, burned effigies, and filled the streets with chants. No taxation without representation. In Boston, they gathered under a mighty elm tree, its branches sheltering their boldest dreams. It became their symbol, their meeting place, their message to the world. This land would not kneel, but this resistance wasn't just carried on the shoulders of men. Behind every pamphlet, every boycott, every outcry, there were women. And they weren't waiting quietly. They rose too, the daughters of liberty. Picture a group of women gathered in a New England kitchen, not to gossip, but to strategize. They're spinning thread, brewing herbal teas, teaching each other how to live without British imports. This wasn't just homemaking, it was rebellion, with a needle and a teapot. They wove their own cloth so they wouldn't have to buy British textiles. They held public spinning bees, turning domestic labor into political defiance. Every stitch, every thread, every sip of home-brewed tea whispered the same thing: we will not be controlled. And in these quiet acts of defiance, some of the most radical ideas were born. In Charleston, in Philadelphia, in rural villages along the Hudson and Potomac, people gathered in small groups, forming committees of correspondence. They shared letters, news, plans, no longer isolated colonies. They were becoming a network, a people thinking together, feeling together, organizing together. And then came the violence. In Boston, mobs smashed the windows of British officials. One night, they ransacked the home of Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor. Books torn, furniture broken, paintings slashed. His family fled in terror. Revolution is rarely clean. Some say it was too far. Others say it was the only way power ever listens. But for better or worse, the lines were drawn deeper. What had started as petitions had become protest. What had begun as debate was becoming defiance, and still they were not calling for independence, not yet. These sons and daughters of liberty, they still toasted the king, still saw themselves as British, but it was a different kind of British, one that believed in natural rights, one that believed in local power, one that believed liberty didn't come from Parliament, but from God and reason and the courage to stand. They weren't perfect. They weren't always united, but they were beginning to believe in something larger than their town or trade or title. They were beginning to believe in each other. The sons and daughters of liberty weren't just planning a protest. They were building a movement. One boycott, one spinning wheel, one gathering beneath a tree at a time. They didn't yet know where it would lead. But they knew one thing for certain. Liberty was no longer a whisper. It was a drumbeat, and it was getting louder. March 5th, 1770. The streets of Boston are frozen. The sky hangs low and gray. Footsteps crunch in old snow. Smoke curls from chimneys like ghosts, and in the midst of this bitter stillness, history shatters. It began like a dozen other nights in a tense and angry town. A crowd, a British sentry standing guard. A shout, nobody remembers exactly what was said. A snowball, a chunk of ice, maybe even a club, thrown from the dark. What matters is what came next. Imagine being there, you're 17, an apprentice. You've just finished your shift. You step out into the cold for air and find yourself pressed between angry townsfolk and a line of soldiers gripping muskets. You see a man with a club. You see red coats gleaming. You hear someone scream, "Fire, damn you, fire." And then, they do. Crispus Attucks goes down first, a dock worker, a sailor, a man of African and native descent, a man who would become the first to die in the name of American liberty. They said he staggered forward even as the bullet struck his chest. He didn't beg, he didn't run. 4 more would die, dozens wounded, the crowd fled, the snow turned red, and in the chaos, something irreversible had happened. The revolution had its first martyrs. In the days that followed, Boston boiled with rage. The soldiers were arrested. John Adams, yes, that John Adams, agreed to defend them in court, not because he supported the crown, but because he believed that justice had to stand, even in fury. And yet, something had shifted. What had once been protests over taxes now bore the weight of blood. What had once been about rights now smelled of vengeance. Asterisk, asterisk, gently. Asterisk, asterisk, the image spread like wildfire. Paul Revere's engraving of the massacre was printed, reprinted, carried from village to town, from Virginia to Connecticut. Even those who weren't sure they cared about the debates in Boston, now they saw it. Redcoats firing into unarmed colonists, smoke, bayonets, young men lying still in the street. It was art, it was propaganda, it was grief wrapped in ink, and it worked. Across the colonies, people whispered, if this could happen in Boston, where will it happen next? How long until they fire on us? What are we willing to do to stop it? What's powerful about this moment isn't just the blood spilled. It's the way it transformed people's understanding of what was happening. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was occupation. This was force. This was what it felt like to be ruled by an empire that didn't see you as fully human. The victims were buried days later in a procession of thousands. Shops closed, bells tolled. In silence, men and women walked the snow-covered streets, heads bowed, children holding lanterns, not in anger, in mourning. And that is when something happened inside the American soul. A question began to echo louder now, harder to silence. If we are willing to die for liberty, what are we willing to live for? The Boston Massacre wasn't the beginning of the war, but it was the beginning of the emotional war. A war in hearts, a war of conscience, a war of belonging. Do we belong to Britain, or do we belong to something new, something not yet named? Over the next few years, tension would rise and fall. Laws passed, repealed. Protests swelled, then calmed, but the line drawn in Boston, marked in blood and snow, never fully faded. Even today, you can walk the cobbled street in front of the old State House and find a ring of stones. A silent memorial to the moment when anger became sacrifice, when neighbors became patriots, and ordinary people realized they were no longer subjects. They were something else entirely. They were the first to fall in a revolution not yet born. But they would not be the last. It was a night soaked in silence and seawater. December 16, 1773, Boston Harbor, moonlight ripples on the waves, crates sit stacked aboard 3 merchant ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, still and silent like floating fortresses. But beneath that stillness, something stirs. You hear the rhythm of feet on frozen cobblestone, the whisper of cloth as men wrap their faces in ragged disguises, the low murmur of strategy, not a riot. Not a mob. This wasn't about tea. Not really. It was about control. Here's the scene. Parliament had passed the Tea Act earlier that year, not to raise a new tax, but to rescue the floundering British East India Company by giving it monopoly power to sell tea directly in the colonies. Cheaper tea, sure, but also unchosen tea, See, colonists weren't angry about the price, they were angry about the principle, the idea that Britain could still tax them, still control their economy, still dictate the terms of their consumption, without giving them a single vote. And so, tea became tyranny in a cup. Imagine you're a Boston merchant. You've struggled for years to stay afloat. Now the crown picks favorites, undercuts your prices, bypasses your business. Your neighbors are boycotting British goods. Your shelves are bare. Then one day, 3 ships arrive loaded with 342 chests of tea, and the people around you say, "This cannot stand." Meetings erupt. Pamphlets fly. And then, a decision is made. The tea must not land. Over the next 20 days, colonists demand that the governor send the ships back to England. He refuses. By law, the tea must be unloaded, or seized and taxed by force. That night, 5,000 people gather at the Old South Meeting House. The crowd spills into the street, lit by lantern light and fueled by defiance. No votes, no compromise, no retreat. A voice rises above the crowd. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. And with that, the signal was clear. Dozens of men, some dressed in cloaks, feathers, soot-blackened faces, inspired by Mohawk imagery, move through the streets in silence. They carry axes, clubs, purpose. They climb aboard the ships, and with no blood spilled, no fire lit, no threats made, they begin their work. They destroy 92,000 pounds of tea, worth over $1 million today. They sweep the decks clean. They replace broken locks. They take nothing. They steal nothing. They leave behind only wet boards and empty crates. This wasn't chaos. It was a ceremony. One participant later recalled that it was the stillest night Boston ever knew. And in that stillness, the colonies changed, because here, at last, was a line. This wasn't petition. This wasn't protest. This was rebellion, and the Empire noticed. When word reached London, fury followed. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, what the colonists would call the Intolerable Acts, designed to crush Boston into submission. The port of Boston shut down, town meetings banned, British soldiers quartered in private homes, Massachusetts self-government dissolved. It was collective punishment. Punishment for a city, for a colony, for a people growing too bold. But instead of isolating Boston, the crackdown bound the colonies together. Committees of correspondence began buzzing again. Newspapers from Georgia to New Hampshire reprinted the story, and a phrase began to take root. The cause of Boston is the cause of all. This wasn't just tea in the harbor anymore. It was the beginning of American unity. The Boston Tea Party didn't bring war, but it made peace nearly impossible. It told an empire, we will not be bent, we will not be bought, and if our voices aren't heard, then our silence will sink your ships. In that cold December harbor, liberty steeped deeper than tea, and the tide was beginning to turn. The harbor was still, the tea was gone, but the cost was just beginning. News traveled slow in 1773, but fury traveled fast. When word of the Boston Tea Party reached London in January, Parliament erupted in outrage. To them, this wasn't protest. It was sabotage, insult, treason in disguise. And the Empire answered, not with understanding, but with punishment. The Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, the Quartering Act together, they became known to the British as the Coercive Acts. But to the colonists, they were intolerable. Let's break them down. 1. The Boston Port Act slammed the harbor shut. Until the tea was paid for, trade stopped, jobs vanished. Ships stood idle like ghosts in the fog. Boston's lifeblood had been cut off. Imagine standing on the docks. The salty wind still whips your face, but there are no cries from the mast, no crates to haul, no sails to tie. You're a cooper, a longshoreman, a merchant's apprentice. Now you're nothing. 2. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the colony's right to self-rule. The king's appointed officials would now handpick councilors. Town meetings banned unless approved. For a people raised on local governance, this wasn't just political. It was personal. The town meeting was the soul of New England life. Now, that soul was silenced. 3. the Administration of Justice Act, or, as colonists called it, the Murder Act. It allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, not in the colonies. To many, it meant this: if a soldier shot your son in the street, justice would sail across the ocean, never to return. And 4, the Quartering Act revised and expanded, forced colonists to house British troops wherever needed. Your home, no longer yours, your hearth, no longer private, your family, watched over by foreign eyes. This wasn't just a message to Boston. It was a message to all 13 colonies: fall in line or face the same. But something happened that no one in London expected. Boston did not collapse, it resisted. And more astonishingly, other colonies, once distant and indifferent, rallied to its side, because now the punishment made things clear. This wasn't just about Massachusetts, it was about control, and who had the right to govern free people. In Virginia, a young legislator named Thomas Jefferson sits by candlelight, reading the details of the Intolerable Acts. He doesn't just see injustice. He sees a threat to every colonial assembly. So he drafts a resolution, calling for a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity with Boston. And when the governor dissolves the Virginia House of Burgesses for it, they meet anyway in a nearby tavern, because when a government silences your voice, sometimes you just find a louder room. All across the colonies, committees sprang into action. Donations poured in: barrels of rice from the Carolinas, flour from Pennsylvania, cattle from Connecticut, all sent to feed the people of a besieged Boston. It was a continental awakening. For the first time, colonists began to see themselves not as separate provinces, but as part of something larger. If Boston could bleed today, Virginia might bleed tomorrow. This unity would soon take form, just months later, in the gathering of delegates in Philadelphia. Men who had never met. Men from farms and port towns, from southern plantations and northern parishes. They came not knowing exactly what they would do, only that they had to do something, and while they met, debated, and worried over what resistance might cost. Outside those halls across the countryside, a new feeling stirred, not rebellion, not yet, but readiness. The Intolerable Acts were meant to crush a city, to divide a continent. Instead, they did the opposite. They turned grief into resolve, silence into speech, and scattered colonies into a common cause. From punishment came purpose and the first real glimpse of a nation not yet born. The bells of Philadelphia rang differently that September. Not for weddings, not for war, but for something in between. It's the morning of September 5th, 1774, and if you were walking through the cobbled streets of this bustling colonial city, you might have seen something strange. A coach rumbling through the mud, streaked road, its wheels caked with miles of travel. Inside, delegates, merchants, lawyers, planters, doctors, from 12 of the 13 colonies, 12 voices, 12 histories, 12 very different visions of what this land should be, and yet, they came. The call for a Continental Congress didn't begin with fanfare, it began with fear. After the Intolerable Acts struck Boston, many wondered, are we next? And so colony after colony sent their brightest and boldest to what would become a historic gathering. Not a government yet, not a revolution yet, but the first spark of unity. They met here, inside a modest brick building tucked behind a Quaker meeting house. Carpenter's Hall, no grand domes, no marble, just plain wood, rough chairs, and heavy hopes. Some of these men had never left their own colonies. Some had never spoken to a Virginian or shaken hands with a New Yorker. Many distrusted each other, but the moment demanded more than suspicion. Imagine sitting in that warm room, the scent of ink and sweat and pine lingering in the air, John Adams scribbling in his diary, Patrick Henry, already known for his fire, John Jay, cautious and precise, and George Washington, quiet, observant, yet exuding a calm gravity. They didn't all agree. In fact, they argued constantly. Should they call for outright resistance or reconciliation? Should they raise militias or cling to peaceful protest? To some, like John Dickinson, war was madness. To others, like Samuel Adams, peace was a fading dream, but disagreement didn't break them, it refined them. Over 51 days, They crafted a response to Britain's tightening grip, a response both measured and unmistakable. They issued the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a bold document asserting that colonists were entitled to the rights of Englishmen. They weren't begging, they were claiming no taxation without representation, no standing armies in peacetime without consent, the right to assemble, the right to petition, not the language of rebellion, but of awakening. And yet they weren't naive. They knew words alone might not sway the empire, so they took action. They called for a boycott, a non-importation agreement that would halt British goods from flowing into the colonies. No British cloth, no tea, no sugar, no luxuries from a mother country acting like a master. It wasn't just politics. It was sacrifice. Think of the merchant in Charleston, pulling British goods off his shelves. The housewife in Boston, weaving homespun cloth instead of buying fine linen. The dockworker in Philadelphia, watching fewer ships come in. They weren't soldiers, but they were fighting all the same. That winter, colonists across the land made do with less, but they gained more than comfort. They gained conviction, and the Congress didn't stop there. They agreed to reconvene in the spring, unless Parliament changed its course. Spoiler, it didn't, but by then this gathering, this first Continental Congress, had done something extraordinary. It hadn't just written documents or signed pledges. It had seeded the idea of a continental identity. For the first time, Americans, yes, they were beginning to use that word, were starting to see themselves not as Bostonians, Virginians, or Carolinians, but as one people, bound not by a crown, but by principles. They came to Philadelphia with fear. They left with purpose. And though the road ahead would be long and bloody, one thing was now certain: resistance had found its voice. The fire had not yet spread, but the kindling had been laid, and the spark was coming. It began with the sound of hooves, not in Lexington, not in Concord, not yet, but in the chill of a September morning, before the famous shots rang out. Fear galloped ahead of revolution. September 1st, 1774. The sun hadn't even touched the rooftops of Massachusetts when General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in America, made a move, quiet, calculated. Cold under the cover of darkness, British troops slipped out of Boston, their target, a powder magazine in Charlestown just a few miles away. Inside that stone storehouse lay gunpowder, the lifeblood of resistance, the very thing that would fuel muskets if ever it came to open conflict. But Gage wasn't waiting for a fight. He was making sure the colonists couldn't. The redcoats reached the storehouse just as the mist still clung to the fields. They seized every last ounce of powder and removed the cannons too, and then they left, mission complete. No shots fired, but that wasn't the story that reached the countryside. By noon, rumors exploded like wildfire. The British fired on civilians. Boston is under siege. The redcoats are marching toward Cambridge. Blood has been spilled. Imagine standing in your fields in Sudbury or your blacksmith shop in Concord and hearing the news. Not from newspapers, but from riders out of breath, wild-eyed, calling every able-bodied man to arms, and you drop your tools. You grab your musket from above the hearth. You kiss your wife's forehead, hug your children tightly, and march. Within hours, thousands of militiamen were on the move. Estimates say as many as 4,000 Colonial men, some from over 20 miles away, took up arms and began marching toward Boston, ready to confront British forces. It was spontaneous, massive, instant, all over a rumor, but it tells us something crucial. The people were ready not because they were eager for war, but because trust was already broken. The powder alarm wasn't just about missing gunpowder. It was about what that missing gunpowder meant. To the colonists, it meant this: if they didn't act now, they might lose the means to defend themselves altogether. The British may have thought they were preventing rebellion, but in truth, they were proving it was necessary. No one knew it yet, but the powder alarm was a dress rehearsal for what would come 7 months later, and Gage, he noticed, the sheer speed, the numbers, the fervor of the colonial response shocked him. If one simple powder raid could summon thousands of armed men, what would happen if real violence broke out? The answer scared him. And it should have, because now the colonists knew their own power, and they began organizing not just with anger, but with intent. Committees of safety were formed. Colonial militias drilled more regularly. Leaders like Dr. Joseph Warren and Samuel Adams knew that the next time the British marched, it might not be for powder. It might be for people. Imagine being a British officer in Boston, looking out at the surrounding countryside, and realizing the roads are no longer safe. The countryside is no longer quiet. The people are watching and waiting. The powder alarm ended without bloodshed, but not without consequences. The British realized they had underestimated the colonial networks, the speed of information, the unity of the militias. The colonists realized they weren't just angry, they were prepared, and maybe most importantly, they now understood just how quickly they could mobilize. It wasn't a war, but it was the beginning of a mindset that this struggle, this fight for liberty, might really come, and when it did, they wouldn't be caught sleeping. So if you ever wonder when the revolution truly began, it wasn't just in 1775 or 1776 or with a declaration. It may have begun the moment thousands rose up. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. It's just after midnight, April 19th, 1775. The moon hovers low over the Massachusetts countryside. Dew clings to the grass, dogs stir, lanterns flicker behind shuttered windows. The wind carries only one sound. A lone rider barrels down a country road, his cloak snapping like a sail in the breeze. He leans low, shouting as he passes homes. The regulars are coming out, not to stir panic, to awaken a people already prepared. This wasn't the start of a war, not yet, but it was the point of no return. The British had set out from Boston under cover of darkness, around 700 redcoats marching quietly through the stillness. Their mission: seize a rumored cache of weapons in Concord, capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams, two of the loudest colonial voices. General Gage hoped for surprise, but surprise was gone. Writers like Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott had already scattered across the countryside, an unofficial alarm system riding faster than any army could march. So when the redcoats reached the town of Lexington just before sunrise, they found waiting for them a small line of 77 militiamen standing in formation on the village green. Ordinary men, farmers, shopkeepers' sons, some shaking, many praying. They weren't there to fight. They were there to stand. The British commander barked, "Disperse, ye villains, lay down your arms," and for a moment, just a heartbeat, the two sides faced each other, and then it happened, a single shot. No one knows who fired it, no one knows why, but in that flash of gunpowder, the world changed. British muskets exploded into fire. Smoke cloaked the green. 8 colonists fell dead, more wounded. It lasted 2 minutes. And yet, it split history in half. The British didn't linger. They marched on to Concord, where they found the supplies mostly gone, hidden by locals in anticipation. But what they didn't know was that hundreds, then thousands, of militia men were closing in. By mid-morning, they reached North Bridge just outside Concord. There, on the rise of a grassy hill, hundreds of colonists stood shoulder to shoulder, defiant, ready, and this time, when British soldiers fired, the Americans fired back. It wasn't rumor, it wasn't alarm, it was war. Picture it: smoke curling through budding trees, the crack of muskets echoing across the river, red-coated soldiers stumbling back over the bridge as colonial fire intensified. Outnumbered and unnerved, the British began to retreat, but the road back to Boston, it was hell. From behind stone walls, fences, and thick woods, colonists fired relentlessly. A moving storm of musket fire followed the British for 18 grueling miles. By the end of the day, 73 British soldiers were dead, nearly 200 wounded or missing. Colonial losses were fewer, but deeply felt. Each man lost was a neighbor, a brother, a father. There was no turning back now. Lexington and Concord weren't major battles. There were no flags planted, no cities won, but everything changed that day, because for the first time, American blood had been shed over American rights. Revolutions don't always start with declarations. Sometimes they begin with silence, with fear, with whispers in the night. And then, one day, they begin with a shot no one meant to fire. Word spread fast. The next morning, newspapers called it a massacre. Letters were sent to every colony, and in the minds of many, the question was no longer, can we reconcile, but will we survive? And so began the American War for Independence, not with celebration, but with sorrow. Not with strategy, but with instinct. Not with congresses or documents, but with courage, with ordinary people saying, no more. From that day forward, there was no such thing as a neutral man, because in the fields of Lexington and Concord, liberty bled, and once blood is spilled for freedom, the world never forgets.